Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello fantasy fiction fans. We're all fans of fantasy, and we're all either authors of fantasy or prospective authors of fantasy. But what is fantasy? Well, number one, why not spell it like the Greeks spelt it? P-H-A-N-T-A-S-I-E. Just for fun. Fantasy. Fantasy is known in the music world as the play of imaginative invention, and I quite like that definition, and I think it fits fiction as well as it fits music. So fantasy involves three elements: play, imaginative and invention. So let's take each element separately, one at a time, and let's study them. So let's start with play, because that's an important element in fantasy. So what is play? Well, it's an activity that's done for recreational pleasure and enjoyment. It's intrinsically motivating. In other words, it's a behaviour that's driven by satisfying internal rewards and especially autonomy. In other words, what I mean by that is it satisfies one's desire to control one's own destiny. It's done to learn or to hone skills. It's done to reach desired goals. It's done to aid self-efficacy, in other words, to build on one's own strengths. And it's done with the inspiration to master rather than just get by in a subject. And it's done without pressure from anybody else, but to satisfy one's own interests. So that's what play is. If your writing is freely expressed and intrinsically motivated and efficacious for you, and it's inspiring and satisfying for you to do, then it will be, number one, fantasy, and it will be, number two, not a chore to write, because it will be highly rewarding. So I suppose the opposite side of that is that if your writing is becoming fruitless and it's becoming joyless for you, then it might be because you're not playing anymore. Do you see? So that's why play is an important element in fantasy. Now there's a quote by a Dutch cultural historian whose name is Johan Huizinga that quite brilliantly sums up the concept of play. And my personal interpretation of Huizinga's quote, I wanted to share with you because I think it ought to reverberate inside the skulls of every single fantasy fiction author out there. So here's his summing up of what play is. He says, play is quite consciously outside ordinary life, in that it is intentionally not serious. But at the same time that it's not serious, it's also intensely and utterly absorbing. Play is an activity that should not be connected to any material interest or any profit. Play proceeds within its own boundaries of space and time and according to its own fixed rules, and it proceeds in an orderly manner. And play promotes the formation of social groupings that tend to surround themselves with secrecy and to stress their differences from the outside common, in scare quotes, world. That's Heisinger's summing up of play. Now, the National Institute for Play, and there is such a thing, has described 7 play patterns that perhaps you, as a writer, can utilise when you're playing fantasy fiction. So here goes with them. Number 1, attunement, attunement. This is to play in order to establish connections. So picture children playing in a playground and they're playing something like It, or they're playing tag. What they're doing there is really creating social connections. Are you creating connections with your readership? J.K. Rowling, for example, chose attunement when she decided to use school children as her main characters because she knew that that would resonate with her readership. Physical play. This is the play that explores and interacts with the world by discovering what happens when one thing interacts, i.e. comes into contact with another thing. Touch reveals whether contact with the other thing might be repulsive or delightful. So are you using physical play in your writing? Object play. This is the banging of pots and pans, handling physical objects, or playing with strange and curious articles, things that you're not familiar with. Because playing with strange and familiar articles and things you're not familiar with brings understanding and it satisfies wonder. And then number 4, there's social play. This involves others in an activity group that build and share connections with others. Will your fantasy fiction help build these type of groups? And then there's pretend play. These are invented scenarios that might help a person act out something that could never be achieved by them inside a real world. Really, the beginning of fiction in the purest sense is this pretend play. Think of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan and how he takes the darlings with him by allowing them to hold on to his shirt tails as he flies across the sky in order to participate in pirate play. Storytelling play. This is all about learning and language and allows for retelling. Can your story be repeated out loud? For example, would your story pass the elevator pitch, also known as the elevator speech? And like a fairy tale, or like a nursery rhyme, or like a folk tale, can your story be easily memorised? Can your story be retold quickly and efficiently? And then there's creative play. Does your story take you, and perhaps your reader, to a higher state? For example, imagine a person who plays a musical instrument. When they become extremely proficient at their instrument, does their play take them and their listeners to a higher plane? Einstein was a great believer in playing with wonder. In other words, he suggested that when a person wonders about things that are not yet known, and a person plays with unproven ideas, this play becomes a bridge to discovering new knowledge. So that's the play element of fantasy. And what's the next constituent of it? The next constituent is imagination. So let's look in more detail at what imagination is. Imagination is the ability to produce and simulate novel objects and ideas in the mind. Imagination makes knowledge helpful. Without imagination, there's no point in possessing knowledge. Imagination is crucial if one wants to solve problems, and it is fundamental to the experiential learning process. The experiential learning process is the opposite of learning something parrot fashion, or what we used to call, back in the 1960s when I went to school, learning by rote, R-O-T-E. Back in those dark days of education, we had to learn the definition of words and mathematical tables and historical dates and geographical place names, etc., by rote, which means we had to learn them parrot fashion. But everybody used to agree then, and they still do, that we would rather learn by doing. If we watched somebody do something, then we tried to copy them, and then we tried to do it ourselves. And then perhaps we'd make a few mistakes, and maybe the person who was showing us would give us some tips, and then we'd try again. We'd learn quicker than just learning parrot fashion. And that is the experiential learning process. Now once, when I was a tutor, and this is many years ago when I was employed to tutor new apprentices, I came across an apprentice who literally could not imagine an outcome. Now, if you don't know what the experiential learning process is, and it's sometimes, by the way, abbreviated to EXL, I will quickly go through it with you because it will help to explain the point I'm about to make. Now, there's a guy, he's a famous bloke named David Kolb, Kolb, and he formulated what's now called the experiential learning model, ELM. And it becomes very useful when you want to meaningfully teach a new apprentice some new skills, especially if those new skills are absolutely required if they are ever to become proficient in their trade. So a tutor will offer his apprentices or her apprentices some concrete experiences, and this is normally through some safe role play, but sometimes it's through easy tasks that won't hurt them, and they are asked to watch and reflect on what they see and what they hear and what they feel and what they experience. A tutor will ask the apprentices to notice what happens during the experience, and the tutor will urge the apprentices to ask why things happened. And the tutor will urge the apprentices to think about how they might use those experiences to improve their own performance. So there's basically 4 parts to the experiential learning model. It's a cycle, and the cycle is active experimentation, followed by concrete experience, followed by reflective observation, and followed by abstract conceptualization. And that last one, abstract conceptualization, may well lead back to the first one again, active experimentation, especially if the apprentice needs to polish up something to get it right. And on my show notes, I'll put down the experiential learning cycle for you so you can see it for yourself. Now, imagine if an apprentice can't solve a problem in the mind. Imagine if an apprentice can't conceptualize. If the apprentice has difficulty with the reflective stage of the cycle, and the apprentice is absolutely overwhelmed by the concept of abstract thought, then how can an apprentice complete the experiential learning process? He can't. Now, he might be amazing at learning by rote, and the person that I was trying to tutor was very good at learning parrot fashion. But apprenticeships are about doing something, not saying something. And this chap that I'm talking about, he actually couldn't do the thing that was asked of him because he failed at the experiential learning process, because he failed at the abstract conceptualization stage. And believe me, we tried everything for this guy. Me and the other tutors, we tried group activities, we tried brainstorming sessions, we did improv theatricals, we played with the 5 Ws, and we tried everything. But it seemed clear to us that this guy literally could not think outside the box. Thinking outside the box is using constructive imagination to put ideas into practice. The English author Geoffrey Chaucer, which you've probably heard of, came up with the concept of something that he calls the mind's eye to explain this. In his Canterbury Tales, he introduced the story of 3 men who dwelt in a castle, but one of the men was blind. This man could only see with the eyes of his mind. In other words, he could only see with the eyes which all men see after they become blind. Nevertheless, this man, the blind man, could see the outcomes of events as well as any of the other men, and perhaps better. And that's because he was able to visualise things internally better than they could visualise things externally. But the condition of not being able to visualise things at all, the condition of not being able to think outside the box, is known as aphantasia. aphantasia. And the word comes from the Greek fantasia, which we've been talking about earlier, which means, of course, just imagination, and with the prefix a. So it becomes a without word. So any word which starts with a is a without word. So aphantasia means without imagination. And our poor apprentice, the guy I just told you about, the guy with no imagination, that poor guy was aphantasiac. He had to go. We were sorry to see him leave, and we felt actually at the time that we'd failed him. It was difficult for tutors to deal with somebody like him. But it took me a long time actually to realise that we could never have succeeded with him because of his aphantasia. It was a condition that he suffered from. So, anyway, to conclude this part, fantasy is imagination and imagination is fantasy. My biggest complaint about a lot of fantasy fiction writers is that they lack imagination. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that writers suffer aphantasia. Well, I hope they don't. If they are aphantasic, then I suggest they look for another career. But I do suggest that some have become lackadaisical and languid in their approach to their writing. Not all, some. And I'm not suggesting that they're lazy. I'm just suggesting that they're not being imaginative. They're stuck in the world of rote learning. That is, they're stuck in the world of repetition and cliché and regurgitation and hackery. How will you avoid this? You'll have to start to play. Play with language. Play with notions. Play with plots. Play with emotions. Play with possible outcomes. Play with your characters. Be properly imaginative and think outside the box. Be energetic with your thought games and put some rigour in. The last part of the definition of fantasy is invention. So let's look at that. Now, hopefully you will have written, or you are about to write, or you're going to write in the future, a novel. Is your book a novel? And what I'm asking here really is, does your book contain novelty? So, they came up with a novelty test. And this is to prove whether something is novelty or not. So do you want to hear it? Here's my own interpretation of the novelty test that they use when they're thinking about trademarking or copywriting materials. Are you ready? Number 1, can your novel be clearly and exactly described as innovative? Number 2, does your novel do what it promises to do? Number 3, is your novel clearly and unmistakably different from other novels that seek to do something similar? Does your novel give the end user, in this case it's the reader, what he or she wishes for? Is your novel understandable to a person with just ordinary knowledge? Does your novel bring about the proper end result that it's required to bring about? And lastly, is your novel contained within one useful fabrication? To be a truly inventive writer, I urge you to try to incorporate some invention in your writing routines. And this will help you create something that is truly novel. And here's some of the ideas that I use, and I urge you to try to think of using these yourself. Many writers I know, some good, some learning, some very good, some adequate, use many of these techniques. Number 1, try to use drawings and images to stimulate your inventions. Number 2, play with ideas via trial and error, perhaps through writing some short stories or some poems. Number 3, make or play with models or use music to kickstart originality. Number 4, experiment with ideas by testing them out for your own amusement and just for fun. You don't have to test them out on readers, just do it for yourself. And next, keep a notebook and note down any random thoughts you have during the day. I keep half a dozen notebooks and they're always on the go. And next, keep a scrapbook. Keep evocative scraps and images that somehow prompted you to think a particular way. And then every now and again go through the scrapbook and look at the old scraps again. And work on several inventions at once, because this helps invigorate your flights of fancy. And become an open and a curious thinker. Don't be confined by boundaries and pigeonholes. And fuse concepts or elements from different contexts and try to re-envision things that you once took for granted. Explore your insights, and finally, if you must copy an idea, be sure to improve upon it. So in conclusion, fantasy must involve play, it must be imaginative, and it must be inventive. If your written work isn't playful, and it isn't imaginative, and it isn't inventive, it might still be fiction, but it won't be fantasy fiction. Good luck with your fantasy fiction, and let me know how you get on.